Michael Ledeen is a specialist in foreign policy, and in particular Iran, the Middle East, Europe, Italy. We'll get to that in a few moments, the US-China relations, and intelligence matters, and Africa. I'm quite impressed. He's a former consultant to the United States National Security Council, the United States Department of State, and the US Department of Defense. He's also served as a special advisor to the United States Secretary of State. Just like me. He now joins me from Washington, D.C. Welcome to you, sir.
Good morning. Happy Monday.
Let's talk about Iran first, the gift that keeps on giving. But just today, the Russians have said that we strongly urge no attack on Iran, that the repercussions are beyond calculation. Do you think there will be some form of direct military intervention by Israel, the US, the UK, even perhaps vicariously Saudi Arabia on Iran?
How would I know? How would any of us know? To answer that question, which is, at the state of my knowledge anyway, unanswerable, we would have to know what the Israelis and the Americans and the Brits think they know about the actual state of the Iranian military nuclear project. We don't know that. What I've always said about this is that the day the head of Israeli military intelligence comes to the Israeli prime minister and says, "Sir," or "Madam," as the case may be, "we've got 5 months or 6 months." At that moment, Israel has to act. And when Israel decides to act, I don't think we're going to hear about it. I think they're just going to do it. That's what they've always done in the past.
So let's rephrase the question then. Is it only a matter of time until the Israelis realize we've got less than a year to go? The Iranians are not stopping. We know that. There's no point in them doing so. They have certain ambitions and aspirations. They're moving towards it. Eventually, it can't be that far away. We're talking probably at most 2 years. You think if it comes to a 6-month period, then Israel will act?
Yeah, I think if it comes down to 5 or 6 months, Israel will act. I mean, they can't afford to fine-tune it. When the head of military intelligence says they've got a nuclear warhead and they are now in the process of marrying it to an accurate missile, at that point, you can't play around anymore. Sanctions are not going to stop the Iranian nuclear program. There's only 2 things that are going to stop the nuclear program: a direct assault against the program itself, and that can be either military or, as we've seen, these various Stuxnet things and various other scenarios, or the regime has to fall. If the regime falls, then everybody's got a lot more time and we can wait and see who succeeds this crowd.
Now, is there a difference between the current regime having nuclear capabilities and the current regime actually using them? Because for many of us, it's beyond our comprehension. We know they rattle sabers a lot and they can be extreme and fanatical, but they would actually use it knowing it would lead to probably joint destruction?
Look, I'm an historian of the 20th century. I worked on fascism, Nazism, communism, etc. And it's just amazing how many people said things that were considered to be just totally crazy and obviously designed to influence and affect domestic political opinion. But it turned out they meant them, and they did them. So I don't think that any prudent government can afford to make any other assumption than that they mean it. So when Iran says we're going to remove Israel from the map, Israel must take that seriously. We pay our leaders to protect us against worst-case scenarios, not to go whistling down the street and say not to worry, they don't mean it.
Now, there's one face shown to us by the Islamic world, another that is the reality. We know that Saudi Arabia, even post-Arab Spring, Egypt, I suspect Jordan, do not want Persian Shia power to increase. They don't want the Iranians to be nuclear.
Right.
So they probably would say a great deal after, if there was such an attack, but do very little. But many in the Muslim street across the world would then go into action and try to hurt the West in any way they could.
Would they? I don't know. I remember hearing all this 10 years ago when we went into Afghanistan, and every journalist who could get in front of a camera was yelling and screaming, saying the Arab street is going to run with blood. They're going to attack Americans everywhere. Nothing happened. Nothing at all. So I'm not convinced of that.
Is there not a difference, though, between intervention in Afghanistan and an Israeli attack? And this is Israel, and this psychosis about Israel, the Jewish state, being this great center of evil, And I'm nowhere near an expert on this, but it may well be that the attack, to really be successful, could even be in some way nuclear, on the nuclear facilities. Again, you don't think the reaction will be intense from the Arab street, the Arab mob?
I don't know. Think back to, what was it, 2006, when Israel attacked Hezbollah? And half the Arab world came out rooting for Israel and said, or egged them on and said, oh, finally Hezbollah is going to get what it deserves. Finally, the Israelis are going to do it to them, and so on. I don't know. I do not, you know, what people say in that part of the world often has very little relationship to what they do.
Yes.
In our part of the world, too, for that matter. So I wouldn't make any assumptions. And also, I think that the thinking about attack against nuclear facilities, even if it comes to that, has been much too narrow. I mean, there's a million scenarios, of which, in my opinion at least, the least likely is the bombing run. If I were a prime minister of a country that was going to attack Iran, I wouldn't send my pilots over Iran. I'd find other ways to do it. There's lots of other ways to do it.
All right. I just briefly asked you to explain to people, because we tend to get a very simplistic view of the Middle East, Israel on one side and Arabs on the other. Iran is not Arab, it's Persian, it's Shia and not Sunni. Let's forget the Persian aspect. Let's talk about the Sunni-Shia aspect. I mean, in Lebanon for the longest time, that there was a hateful battle, a war between the two groups. There are no Shia left in Egypt. Saladin got rid of them. You'll hear sermons in Sunni mosques denouncing Shia Islam more often, actually. You're probably denouncing Jews and Christians. So there is no natural alliance, really, between Shia Iran and the major Sunni powers, is there?
No. On the other hand, I think the enmity between Sunni and Shia has been overdone, greatly overdone. If you go to the web page of Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, you will find that he proclaims himself to be the leader of all Islam. It's not just Shia, it's all Islam. And when Iranians go on Hajj, they proclaim themselves to be representatives of the Islamic world, not the Persian Shia world. And as we've seen, it's very easy for Iran to cooperate, to aid and abet, to finance, arm, train, etc., Sunni terrorists like Al-Qaeda. I mean, Zarqawi operated out of Tehran for years and years. And when he needed money, he got it from them. And when he needed intelligence, he got it from them. And we know a lot now about the close working relationship between Sunni Al-Qaeda and Shia Revolutionary Guards, Basij, and so forth.
Yeah. And, of course, after the 2006 Hezbollah war in Israel, there were Sunni Muslims becoming Shia out of admiration for Hezbollah. But we'll move on when we come back, if we may, to Italy and what is going on there, because that could affect the West more directly, more quickly. We'll be back in a few moments. Thank you. More with Michael Ledeen, and this man really knows his geopolitics. We've discussed Iran, we have that sorted. Let's move on to Italy, and again, this is very timely because, I mean, this interview was booked probably last week, if not before. But as we speak, now maybe this is just hyperbole, but could Italy be the next Greece? It's one thing for Greece to be in financial crisis, it matters, but when it moves on to, say, Italy or Spain, and then not far behind, of course, you have Britain, Germany, and France. But Italy, this would be a major problem. So is this likely? I mean, we think of northern Italy and how productive it is. I know the south has its problems, but is Italy like to face a similar crisis to that we see that is devastating Greece?
Well, I think the whole European community is facing a common crisis. The Italians have probably taken advantage of the largesse of the European Central Bank and the various welfare state programs and some of the others. But I think the latest time I talked to economists, they told me that Spain, in terms of numbers and percentage of GDP and national debt, was in worse shape than Italy. The Italians, you know, I was a correspondent in Italy for some years. I lived there for a long time. And the Italians always get very close to the edge, but seem somehow never to slide into the abyss. And my guess is that that'll happen again now. I mean, the Italians always believe that some power greater than themselves will tell them what to do, and then at the appropriate moment they'll do it after having extorted every bit of advantage along the way. And I think that's basically what's going on right now.
And Berlusconi, The man, I mean, I shouldn't really admit it. I admire him in some ways. Maybe it's just the cheek of the man. But does he have the hold on the people and the influence and the wit and the understanding to really pull his country through this particular period?
Well, let's put it this way. He may not. But, I mean, he may finally have bored the Italians to the point where they can't stand him anymore, and they're saying enough already, somebody else. But there is no obvious successor to him, either as a political party or as an individual leader. I just don't see anyone around whom the country is tempted to coagulate and get them out of this. My guess is that Berlusconi, either as prime minister or head of an interim government, if it comes to that, is the only one who can manage this particular period.
All right. The wider Europe, the European community and the Eurozone, you know, I'm from Britain originally, and as a young man, I remember when the country went into the European community, I don't think it was a popular will. I think it was more the will of the elite persuaded most people it was the right thing to do. But in Britain now, there's calls for a referendum. There's a lot of anger in Germany over the way Merkel was caricatured in Greece. Do you think the European community has a long-term future?
Well, it all depends who's asked that question. If you ask the European people, by and large, they don't like it because it's going badly at the moment. They loved it when going into the Eurozone meant huge loans and investments and infrastructure development and all of that. Now they hate it when all of a sudden the bills have come due and they're actually being asked to pay for all of this stuff, all this welfare state stuff and what have you. So that's why this big furor when Papandreou tried to have a referendum in Greece on should we pay our bills or not, because everybody knew the people were going to say, hell no. So then the Sarkozy and Merkel said, what do you mean you're going to ask the people? You can't. First they said, yes, quite, of course, it's democracy. Of course you're going to ask the people. And the next day they said, well, you can ask them, but you have to ask them the big question, do they want to stay in the European community, the European Union? That's the question you have to ask. And then finally, of course, the referendum was withdrawn. I think if you asked Italians, did they want to stay in, they would say yes. If you asked them, do you want austerity, they would, of course, say no, nobody wants austerity.
I mean, the original notion, I suppose, well, part of the original notion was to be a power bloc in competition with, if not opposition to, the United States and the Soviet Union. Well, the Soviet Union no longer exists. The Americans are fighting hard to maintain themselves as a superpower. We have the emerging China and India, perhaps even Brazil. For those countries in Eastern Europe who are doing well, they're looking to the European community now. At one point, it was all we want is to be in the community. Now they're saying, well, you know, maybe this isn't the way forward anymore.
Yeah, the Czechs never, I mean, the Czechs always had their doubts. What's the name? I forget that wonderful president of the Czech Republic who didn't want anything to do with it and said it was a bad idea and a crazy idea. But in any case, they did it wrong. I mean, we all said at the time that the Eurozone was created, that they're doing it backwards. That is, for this thing to work, you first had to have political union and then monetary union. Monetary union had to be the expression of a political agreement whereby you had an orderly decision-making process and so forth. Instead, they did it the other way around. And I think it's probably worth reminding young people who weren't around when these debates took place that the creation of the euro has nothing to do with finance.
Yep.
It had to do with crazy, almost religious beliefs. Helmut Kohl, the Chancellor of Germany, imbibed the worst stereotype of Germany. He believed basically if we are left to our own devices, we will kill again. Germany will kill again. It's just in our DNA. Therefore, Germany must disappear. Germans have to be dissolved into Europe. And the acid bath, so to speak, that was going to dissolve Germany was the euro, because the euro was going to dissolve the Deutschmark, and the Deutschmark was the symbol of all that was evil in German national character. That's how this thing really started. And all the Germans who came to America to explain it to us kept on saying, you've got to understand, it's not about finance, it's about peace.
Mm-hmm. I'm glad you made this point, and it's very well made, because a lot of people get this wrong. It was never really the bankers, it was the ideologues, and they were quite well-meaning. They'd seen war,
Yes.
older people, and they said that the only way to stop the European tribes once again trying to kill each other is to say that at least we have this financial consensus. But of
Right.
course, we knew that Britain was never going to be part of that, so it was a broken concept from the beginning.
Well, I hope that's right. I mean, I've seen British prime ministers seem to be really tempted about going in.
Yeah.
I mean, the rewards were huge a few years ago. They're smaller now. I think it's not so tempting now.
Yeah, I think so. Look, fascinating stuff. Really enjoyable speaking to you and listening to you. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, my treat.